Hey, and we're back for another episode of the MMA Prospectus. I'm always a little surprised when we're back because we always seem to be this close to just calling the whole thing off and moving on with our lives and beyond MMA and all reason. Re-entering the real world, that would be nice because right now the MMA world blows. But tomorrow should be fun, right? Right, guys? Tomorrow will be fun.
Well, unless Kelvin Gastelum doesn't make it out of the hospital to weigh in to fight Tyrone Woodley, then no, tomorrow won't be fun. Tomorrow won't
And
be fun. Won't
and
be fun
and
at all.
odds are we're gonna have Belfort Weidman ads all night during the pay-per-view, just mocking us, just teasing us with what could have been.
Yeah, that's because it's not even an official UFC announcement right now. It's Junkie broke the story, so the chances are that the UFC will be running that as their official line for like another day before they get out and tell everyone that fight's off.
I mean, apparently the scoop is from John Morgan, which means that it
Yeah,
came from somebody inside the UFC.
yeah.
Like,
No, I,
yeah.
I think that I'm sure everybody knows and everybody's on the same page. I don't doubt it at all. But man, that just blows. Anyway, that's not why we're here because, technically our show, we don't care about Chris Weidman, right? I mean, that's just not even important, not even on our radar. That's not what we do. Yeah, I know. Okay. But we are going to talk about UFC 183 tomorrow, which is not a talent. It's a talent-rich card. It's not a prospect-rich card. I actually really like the main event, but the undercard, where you usually expect to see a bunch of young guys who are really promising and on the rise, there are not a lot of those. Um, Thoughts on like, is there anyone on the undercard that, as a prospect, um, you're really excited about, Tom, at all?
Ah, oh, uh, I mean Jimmy Hettis is pretty exciting when he's on, but not this card seems very much stacked with people we're supposed to know.
Tell
And
us that.
there's nothing wrong with that. These are all like pretty much the entire card is either guys whose name we're aware of, or Thiago Santos and Andy Entz. And Jimmy Hettis is intriguing. He started training recently over with Frankie Edgar's crew. He's a pretty solid takedown guy, but he seemed to have kind of a bit of a disadvantage in the wrestling department. Uh, Submission focused game, which obviously doesn't necessarily work the best on this level of MMA, but he's an interesting, exciting guy. I think we all kind of collectively, as an MMA community, overvalued him after he tossed Nam Fan around because it's Nam Fan. But it's a pretty solid fighter, and in terms of like prelim fights, he to me is the most exciting guy on there. That I'm kind of him and Diego Brandau is the fight on the undercard. Prospect wise, I'm most looking forward to.
Pat, anyone else?
I mean, I agree with Tom on Hettis. He did get overvalued, but I think this is one of those cases where the pendulum has swung too far back in the other direction. Like, he ran into two guys who happened to be like really difficult matchups for him.
Mm-hmm.
He ran into Marcus Brimage, who especially when he was at 145 was really fast, and it was hard to get in on his hips because he was so short and so strong. And Hettis is a guy who likes to get his takedowns from the clinch. It was really hard for him to get them against a guy when he just couldn't get his hips down. He couldn't get his hips under. Even so, he fought back and he made that. He managed to work his way back into the fight and make it pretty close by the end. But then against Dennis Bermudez, like, nobody can take down Dennis Bermudez, and he's just way faster and way more athletic and a way more powerful striker. And I think that as a result, Hettis has been just like the pendulum has swung back too far the other way. We're now drastically undervaluing him instead of overvaluing him. Like, I don't think Diego Brandau is very good. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little. The big thing for me, I think, with Hettis that I've come to terms with, and maybe I'm this is part of the pendulum swinging too far, is that he's a very skilled fighter, but he's like the athletic side is just not quite there. So if the matchup isn't right for his skills, then he's got really big problems. Whereas Brandau is a pretty reasonably decent athlete. Like, he's pretty fast and pretty strong, and he's skilled everywhere, but just mentally he's a basket case and very breakable.
And he's got zero endurance at all. He is at best a one-round fighter, and when you're fighting in a division that's full of guys who can match his speed, athleticism, his physical gifts, and his skills, like you can't just fight for 5 minutes. Or in Brandau's case, it's not even 5 minutes a lot of the time. It's like 3 minutes.
Well, I
So
think for him that gets to the mental thing where like he's really what you can see fights where he'll last longer is when he's really like reserving himself mentally. He's kind of keeping himself in check, trying to keep like don't get overexcited, don't get overextend yourself. And then anytime he does, it's just like it's such a panic, it's such a like frantic outpour of energy that he's just suddenly like done, and that's it.
I mean, I think Brandau is also worth discussing as a case of something that we've talked about a fair bit before on this show about guys who are labeled as prospects but really aren't. Like even when he was coming off of the 14th season of The Ultimate Fighter, so he had already been fighting professionally for 6.5 years.
Yeah.
He really was not a prospect at that point. He should have been in his prime as a fighter, and now there are still people who are saying, well, he's a young guy. He's a young guy. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, he's not super old. I think he's like 27 or so,
Yep.
27 or 28. But
27.
he's coming up on the anniversary of his first fight. He is what he is at this point. He's like, he might get a little bit better, but the odds are against it. He's probably as good as he's going to get. And, I think that's what we're seeing in this booking here. I think the hope is that either Brandau wins in impressive fashion or the UFC can just kind of cut bait and say, okay, we gave this guy 8 fights, 9 fights in the UFC, and he's just not gonna end up as the fighter that we thought he would.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's.
Sorry.
I was gonna say it became abundantly clear in his last 2 fights that he's not going to break through into that top 10. And as you pointed out, I mean, it's pretty much anyone coming off tough, or really anyone making their debut in the UFC who isn't like pushing 35 tends to get labeled as a prospect by the promotion, and it's just one of those things that fans need to stop taking that kind of at face value, that we just accept, or I went through the phase of this where you just accepted whoever you got told was a prospect, because there's not really a great way of kind of determining, like there's not a real system out there for determining it. And I think we all kind of set down our own systems when we started looking at actual prospects. And in other sports, there's very kind of structured ways for guys to get built towards the big leagues, if you will. And Diego Brandau came onto the scene and looked like an absolute killer. I mean, he armbarred Dennis Bermudez in his first UFC fight, the guy who just beat Jimmy Hettis. But Pat, as you point out, I mean, that was Diego Brandau pretty much in the midst of his peak as a fighter, as opposed to still being on the rise. And I think Diego Brandau, if he loses this fight, I mean, he'll still get action on like Brazil cards, I'm sure, and as kind of an action fighter. But I think we'll kind of be done talking about him as being like a overly relevant featherweight.
Well, it would be 2 straight. It would be 3 straight losses. The last 2 have both been first round finishes. So there's a very good chance if he loses here, he'll just be out the door. Especially as a guy who threatens other fighters with stabbing and things like that. I mean, I think there's a very real chance that the UFC would be like, hey, I'm surprised he even got this fight. When you think about it like that, it's just like, at some point, it's like, do we really want the guy who's backstage threatening to stab people in the building? Maybe not.
It's called character, Zane.
Yeah. So, but I think part of that too is that, yeah, I mean, there really is this reliance on the idea of, like, the age is the biggest factor to MMA success. Like, there's still a huge reliance on that. And to the point that, like, I mean, I was trying to argue, I mentioned on another show that, like, Tim Boetsch is a fighter that's, like, still in his prime in terms of his career, like his career length. He's coming to the end of his prime, but he's only been fighting for like 7 or 8 years. This is like, he's still there. It's not like it's just weird that he hasn't fought well in like 4 years, considering it's all been like in the prime of his career.
Well, you bring up a really interesting idea that the age is the factor that everyone looks at. And I think that's mostly because in every other sport, or at least in kind of the major sports in the U.S., age is a factor like that you can really rely on, because if you're looking at a baseball player and he's 23 years old, you have a pretty good sense that like every 23-year-old in the major leagues and in the minor leagues has played an equivalent amount of baseball in their lives and has kind of like an equivalent amount of wear and tear on them. And that's just not true in professional fighting. I mean, I'm sure we're going to get to him, but Jordan Mean is like a case in point that he's 25 years old. He almost has 40 professional fights. I mean,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. He has more fights than some like 10-year veterans. So it's one of those things that I think age gets. I think Zane, you put it perfectly. Age gets over relied on in terms of like a measuring stick for like where a guy is at in his career.
Yeah, I think my key go-to example for that is always Joe Warren, because Yoel Romero is like everybody's like, oh well, Yoel Romero is a freak talent, so obviously you can't judge anything off Yoel Romero, and Joe Warren's a really talented guy too. But when he came in, even I remember I was thinking like, he's really like too old to have a natural career progression. Like he's doing this as a flash in the pan. The moment he started losing, I was like, okay, he's done. This, Joe Warren's just, let's move him through, and he can go out to pasture as another guy who's too old to really get in the game. But the truth is that his career has followed like the prototypical young fighter on the rise progression, where now like 5 or 6 years in, suddenly Joe Warren's the best fighter he's ever been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we see that a lot with these guys. Like Daniel Cormier is another good example of a guy who seems to be following pretty much the exact normal aging curve despite starting much later. And I think we see that with these guys who are freakishly athletically talented. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're talking that in all of these cases we're talking about former Olympians or world-class competitors in their given sports. I mean, look at Joe Warren. Joe Warren fought Kid Yamamoto in what was that, like his second or his third pro fight? Like, these guys are often dealing with really messed up curves, but their actual skill development tends to follow a pretty natural thing.
Yeah.
I mean, a good analog for MMA might actually be heavyweight boxing. So, like, look at Deontay Wilder, who beat Bermane Stiverne in a big heavyweight title fight a couple of weeks ago. I mean, Deontay Wilder, unlike most guys at the lighter weights who start boxing in their early teens, maybe, and they're fighting as amateurs all throughout their teen years, like Wilder didn't start boxing until he was like 18 or 19, and after like 2 years of it was good enough to win a bronze medal at the Olympics. And even now, as a professional, he's got like 32 fights as a professional, 33 fights as a professional, and he's still only been boxing for like 6 or 7 years, So, like, there just are not a lot of guys in other sports who follow that, and it's natural to use age as a proxy marker for wear and tear in stick and ball sports, where there tends to be a very set progression for when guys start playing. Like, so I think it's a holdover there from these other sports.
Yeah,
that's correct.
It is, and it gets into this weird thing where like, and it's something unfortunately that I think that a lot of people in the business, like especially on broadcasters, have yet to pick up on at all. Where you still hear this heavy adherence to like, he's young, he's a prospect, and that's like, that is the label. And so every time you're watching a fight, no doubt we will hear Meehan referred to as like a really hot young prospect.
Yeah, I was
has
just
a lot of years left ahead of him.
Yeah, he's a really hot young prospect who happens to have almost 10 more fights than Thiago Alves, who's the grizzled veteran. And I'm with you, Zane. We're gonna hear it, and it's not correct. It's when you've got 40 fights, you're no longer a prospect. I don't care what combat sport you're in. Maybe like Thailand, where guys have like 500 fights.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was really interesting. I believe this was I believe this was last month. I think it was on the Machida Dalloway card. John Anik and Brian Stan were calling it, and they were talking about Patrick Cummins. And one of them, I believe it was Stan, made the point that
Yeah.
he may not be he may be older, but he really doesn't have that much tread on his he really doesn't have that much tread off his tires. He's really pretty young in the sport. And so I think it's good to see that at least one commentator seems to be getting that particular dynamic.
Yeah, I do remember that. Stan, I even was like kind of marking out by myself on Twitter, running the BE Twitter account, like, oh my God, he's talking about like progression aging curves and like beyond progression curves beyond age. That's kind of amazing. So there are occasional bright flashes as usual, brought to us by Brian Stan, but
kind of on that note, if I might, I think one of the fighters who's kind of getting caught in this, who's fighting on this card, I kind of feel like Sarah McMahon, and I've fallen into this trap a few times where I feel like Sarah McMahon just isn't as good as she should be, and then it's just that she got built up so quickly. She's getting into her 5th year of professional fighting, even though she's already in her 30s. We could still see some significant growth out of her, and I think that the Miesha Tate fight, I mean, if there's an opponent ripe for her to show some growth against, it's Miesha Tate. But I've heard a lot of people kind of writing off Sarah McMahon after her performance against Lauren Murphy, and I know I was perturbed by the fact that it seemed like she had some regression in her game versus Murphy, but I think she's a prime candidate to be one of those kind of late bloomers where we kind of all write off the fact that she's still improving because she's 34 years old.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly expect to see McMahon. I expect McMahon to dominate this fight pretty handily, because in all of the hubbub about her not looking super impressive against Lauren Murphy, who, to be fair, like Lauren Murphy is a really good fighter in her own right, and she's a really tough matchup for McMahon in terms of the kinds of things that she does. Like she has a good guard. She plays off her back. She's really good at it. She's a really solid scrambler. She's a good volume striker on the feet. Like, these are all things that are very difficult for somebody who is not yet super technical in anything other than their specialty to deal with. Like, that was a fight that was tailor made for Sarah McMahon to not look great in it.
Yeah.
And then against Rousey, like, what are you going to do? Rousey is just on a totally different level than everybody she's fighting. But like, if you look beneath that a little bit, there are things that McMahon does that if she were on a normal prospect curve, we would look at those and be like, oh yeah, no, she's about exactly where we would expect her to be. Like, she has her main skill set, but then she's really controlling from the top. She does that really well, and she fires a pretty wicked one too. Like, and that's what we should expect for people who are on her level at this point.
Yeah, well, and Murphy too. When you look at it, like, if you compare her to like, somebody like Claudio Silva or something like that, like, there are fighters that are just built to make their opponents look terrible, whether they win or lose. And Murphy is definitely one of those fighters. Like, she's big and she's tough and she's strong enough to like take all your shots and stay on you and stay aggressive. And that's almost always a recipe for making your opponent look terrible.
Yeah, I think the Miesha Tate fight is going to be really informative on Sarah McMahon, no matter which way it goes, because if she keeps it standing, we're going to get a pretty good look at her striking. Because I think while Tate is kind of a good volume kickboxer, I feel like if McMahon feels like she can work her on her feet, I think we're going to see some serious rounds of McMahon working her striking. I don't think she's going to put Miesha Tate away on the feet. If she decides to go to the ground, I've never been really blown away by Sarah McMahon's mat work. It's good, it's solid, but I feel like if you're as strong of a wrestler as you are, you really want to back up that with a really strong kind of grinding game. And obviously the Shayna Baszler fight wasn't great for her in terms of mat work, and Lauren Murphy was a step forward in that while she didn't look fantastic, she also wasn't getting in trouble in the same way. So I think either way this fight goes, I think Sarah McMahon picks what kind of fight it is, and be it the clinch, be it striking at range, be it on the ground. I think it's going to be very informative on Sarah McMahon's growth, which is why I'm actually looking forward to this fight on some level.
Yeah, well, she should win it everywhere too. I mean, the thing with Tate is even when she comes in technically prepared and skilled in one area, she gets really predictable really fast. Like you look at her fight with Rin Nakai, and like that fight from the get go was like really obviously okay. Misha Tate's gonna run over Rin Nakai, and then like by the second round, her striking was so predictable that Nakai was starting to hit her, and her wrestling was so predictable that Nakai was starting to take her down. And by the third round, she just about lost the third round. And like, you know, against somebody like Sarah McMahon, that's not going to work at all.
It was really like for Tate, that was a really bad performance. Like you should have blown Rin Nakai out of the water. If you can't blow Rin Nakai out of the water, you're not an elite 135-pound fighter. There's no way around that. It's just that simple.
Yeah, and I mean Pat, you've said this publicly a couple times, and I'm 100% with you. I mean, the division and the whole women's side of the sport has just passed Misha Tate by in terms of her fight style, in terms of her athleticism. It's just a different game than it was back in 2010 and 2011. And I mean, the Ronda Rousey fight in Strikeforce was like the moment in which you saw that the game was changing. And since then, I mean, she's beaten Liz Caramouche, who, I mean, I think we can all agree got, again, being overvalued for her performance against Ronda Rousey, and then a really unimpressive win against Rinda Kai.
Well, I didn't think she won the Carmouche fight either. I mean, if you're like, but anyway, so that's I think we've thoroughly covered that, and I guess I do want to look at Thiago Santos and Andy Enns briefly, not because either of them are hot shit or going anywhere, but because that's what we're supposed to do, and there's very little young talent on the undercard. And then we'll go up and look at Iaquinta and Gastelum and Meehan and relieve ourselves quickly of this burden. But I know Enns has gone to MMA Lab, which seems to be funneling in all the Alaska Gracie Jiu-Jitsu people. Is there any prayer that his game actually gets any better? I haven't seen any signs that it will.
I mean, he's just got so little in the way of physical tools to work with. I mean, he's very tough. He's very durable. He's got a lot of heart, but that doesn't translate particularly well to a high-level game. Like, he's got some skills on the ground, but he's got exactly the kind of ground skills you would expect from somebody who was submitting people not terribly easily with some difficulty on the Alaskan regional scene. And you're not going to submit guys with that skill set on the UFC level, generally speaking. Yeah. So his development path has been to become a volume kickboxer, but he's got no power. He's not terribly technical. He relies on cardio and volume, and that's fine. That's a fine game, but there's zero dynamism and there's zero chance of finishing anybody with that. Plus, he's not super fast. Plus, all of that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's hard to be that excited about Thiago Santos too, because while he's aggressive and a medium quality kickboxer, not terrible, but not technically really impressive to any extent, he's also really kind of small for a middleweight, especially in today's middleweight world. He feels like the guy who's not cutting any weight to hang around in the division. So I don't know. It's not a fight to be terribly excited about, which is why we're not going to talk about it anymore unless Tom has something he's desperate to say.
You know what? I had a whole dissertation ready on this one, but I'm just going to let it go.
Okay, so Kelvin Gastelum and John Lineker missed weight. Lineker is he's just basically broken out of the prospect range, and this is his first big top 5 challenge fight to prove that he's an elite fighter. And Gastelum is, he's already had that first top 10 challenge fight to prove that he's a top 10 fighter, and now he's getting that top 5 challenge fight. Are either of these guys, given their terrible weight cutting, going to actually win?
Uh, I mean, I had picked Gastelum going into
Yeah.
this fight,
Oh.
and I think that had he had a reasonable weight cut, and if he'd showed up in something approaching good shape, I think he would have beaten Woodley handily. I mean, just in terms of the pure matchup, I think it favors him. He's a pressure fighter, and Woodley needs to be operating out in the center of the cage. Like
Mhm.
when you push him backwards, he gets super predictable, and that's something that Gastelum is really good at. So on that basis, I had picked Gastelum and felt fairly comfortable about it. He just came in 10 pounds overweight. He had a trip to the hospital. Assuming they let that fight goes on, and they let that fight go on, which they probably shouldn't, given that he was just at the fucking hospital. If we can just talk about that for a second, like, no, I mean, if you're in that bad a shape, like, can he make his cardio work? Like, what happens when Woodley hits him, given that he's depleted and had to go to the hospital while trying to make weight? That's all really bad. These are all really bad signs for Gastelum.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing good about that. And Tyron Woodley is not the kind of opponent you want to come in like in that kind of shape against. Because while he can have bewildering and poor performances, I mean, the man's a pretty top-notch athlete and can absolutely put people away. I mean, the performances that we've seen against Tyron Woodley where he's looked less than I mean he's looked bad in some of his performances. I mean they've all been guys. I mean you're talking about Roy McDonald who's one of the better strikers in the division, and Jake Shields who is a pound for pound all time great at making guys look like shit, and then Nate Marquardt who can just go teching on people. Other than that, I mean I think Gastelum had his hands full in this fight to begin with. Going into a fight in that condition, I think Tyron Woodley trounces him, and the fight most likely shouldn't happen.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for him might be that it might really give if the fight goes on, it might give Woodley a big boost of confidence walking in and make him more likely to fight the fight he wants because he feels like I can beat this guy easily now. And Woodley's a dangerous guy when he's confident. When he thinks that he can absolutely beat you, like when he was facing Josh Koscheck and when he was facing Dong Young Kim, when he doesn't think that you have anything for him, he will just blast you into next week.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So
speaking of guys who kind of who are exactly where we would expect them to be based on the aging curve, or
yeah,
based on the development curve. Woodley didn't start fighting until he was what, like 28,
yep,
something like that.
2009.
Yeah, so he's now coming into his sixth year as a professional. Lo and behold, he started to make real strides in his technical game around now, like right when we would expect him to be entering his prime. It's like, people were all over him when he lost to Marquardt, like, oh, like he got beaten by a dude who's past his prime and, got cut from the UFC, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, oh no, wait, that's just exactly, you would expect a guy who was in like the third year of his career, the fourth year of his career to have a little struggle. And
Yeah,
now he's
Well,
past
and
that.
I think another point, people were all over him for the Nate Marquardt loss because he was coming off that Jordan Mean win. Which, can we just take a moment and reflect how far Tyron Woodley has come since that total disaster of a fight in 2012, where he quite literally just laid in Jordan Mean's guard for 3 rounds. He is a totally different fighter offensively than he was when he was back in Strikeforce. And that's one of those ones where whenever I'm thinking about Tyron Woodley and I look at his record, I see that fight and it gets progressively further away, both in terms of years and just in terms of what kind of fighter he is. He has grown a great deal in the last 3 years as a fighter, and I think we're getting ready to see Tyron Woodley. I mean, as a peak level fighter, and it just sucks that this fight is now either going to be off or the outcome is going to be so tainted by the fact that Kelvin Gastelum was 10 pounds overweight and hospitalized before the fight.
yeah, it's true, and I mean, because yeah, he's just right about to hit his prime, and everything seems to be clicking for him. Everything seems to be falling into place and working, and even to the point, quite miraculously, that he's already like in or borderline top 5. He's like what, 6 or 7 right now, maybe 8 at the outside. I can't remember where he's ranked at the moment. But, most guys, like 6 years in, I mean, you look at Miles Jury, like, I think Miles Jury started fighting right at about the same time, and he's just barely gotten his first chance to, like, get into the level that Woodley's already gotten to. And so Woodley's, he's achieving really exactly the way you'd hope for a fighter who started when he did, and that makes that puts him in a position where anytime that he's facing a fighter who's less than 100%, he should win, which gives you Kelvin Gastelum, and now gives you a fight that I don't think I would pick Kelvin Gastelum in to save my life.
Yeah, I mean, and Woodley, like, regardless of where Gastelum's head is at with his preparation, Woodley has trained his ass off. Like, he actually left ATT for this fight and went up to Wisconsin to Duke Rufus's camp. He trained with Ben Askren. He trained with all those guys. Talked to Eve Edwards today. He brought Eve Edwards and Dean Thomas up with him to help oversee his camp. I mean, Woodley is a true professional, and is really, like, this dude knows what he's doing. He is improving. He's improving at a good rate. He seems to have fixed some of the holes in his game. If he can get out of the habit of just backing to the fence and winging right hands, like, he could legitimately be a top-level welterweight for a while yet, despite the fact that he's getting up into his 30s.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much. I mean, Jordan Meehan, it's really kind of funny. Like, he's in a position where I feel like he's sort of, not to shift things really quickly, but he's in kind of a do-or-die position here, I think, with Thiago Alves. Like, and that's a really weird thing to say about a kid who's 25, but we are at the kind of timing with Meehan where it's sort of like, are you going to make a run? Because now you need to win your fights to make that run. Like, you can't have the amount of wear and the amount of time that he's put on his body, and, like, it would be Anderson Silva-esque with a lot of losses in between for him to be able to keep fighting progressively better and better over the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those situations where, like, yeah, where do we expect him to go from here? He's been training at a small camp for most of his career. He's coming up on 9 years as a professional. He'll have been fighting for 9 years in come June. He really did make improvements when he went down to ATT for the Perpetual camp, and I think he was down there for a portion. Actually, no, he wasn't. He was he stayed at home to train for the Pile fight. But, like, he did seem to benefit from that environment. He made real improvements, especially in his wrestling and his top game. But my big thing with Meehan is I question how much better he can get training at that small gym. He spent this entire camp at home as well. He did not go down to ATT. He didn't go to any bigger place. Training under his dad. Like, I wonder how much better you can possibly get having spent your entire life in that situation.
Yeah, I do still think he beats Thiago Alves, but it is one of those things where I'm not like, it's sort of you are as good as I think you're going to be for the foreseeable future, so every time out you should be winning. Like, that's kind of the end result of that kind of feeling, is that, like, I'm not looking at this as somebody who, like, oh, here's going to be, what's the next evolutionary step going to be? It's just like, are you going to be a title contender right now?
Yeah, and I think it's pretty clear. Jordan Meehan, it falls into that finished product sort of phase. I mean, he's not going to be making big improvements as a fighter. He's hit the point in a career where your improvements come in millimeters, where it's a tiny little improvement here and a tiny little improvement there. And, I mean, he's just 25, and if he continues on a run, he could have kind of a late, maybe he has a late career spring, but I mean, he's put so much wear on his body. When Anderson Silva steps into the cage this weekend, it'll be his 40th professional fight in MMA. Jordan Meehan will have stepped in the cage before him and notched his 39th MMA fight. I mean, he's on that level of, like, number of fights. The guys who started fighting in 1997, he has as many professional fights as guys like that. I mean, it's just, when I see a prospect, when we're looking at prospects and I see guys who have, like, that density of fights in their career, that is a huge red flag for me. I really am not a big fan of this idea of, kind of like pile as many fights in there as we can, because I think the sport is. I know that there are boxers who will pile up just massive records as they come up, but it's just a different place for this sport, and it's just not a good thing for a young prospect to be just packing like 5-6 fights into a year.
Yeah, I mean what the aging curves show us with guys who fight like that is if you're like a full standard deviation above the average, if you're fighting an average of 4, 5, 6 times a year, that would be a full standard deviation above. If you're 1 or 2 standard deviations above the average, like that correlates pretty closely with a reduced peak. That you're not going to have anything resembling exceptional longevity. I mean, like we're seeing this with Jake Ellenberger right now, a guy who's in his late 20s and seems to be actively regressing. But Ellenberger is a guy who fought a ton early on in his career. It just, but compare me to Rory McDonald, who also started fighting when he was 16 or so, but has not had an exceptional number of fights. He spent almost his entire career in the UFC. Training at a big camp, and a guy like that, you still do see continuous improvement from fight to fight. Like you look and you can tell these are the things that Rory has worked on from fight to fight, and he's still getting better. Like in Meehan's case, and you see this with other dudes who spend their entire careers at these small and out of the way camps, they hit a wall and they stop improving at some point. And I wonder how much better Meehan can get. I wonder how much longer his body is going to hold up, because the obvious analog for a guy who started fighting that early is Karo Parisian, and Karo was done as a top fighter by the time he was 24 or 25.
Yeah, or even like Joe Daddy is the other one that I think about too.
Yeah, it's not like by starting young you just get extra years tacked onto your career. Like the clock starts when you start fighting as a professional.
Yeah, and that's something that's like really hard to get people to understand, especially with somebody like Stefan Struve. I remember when he started fighting, when he got to the UFC, people were like, "Oh man, he could be great for another decade." It's just like you realize how much time he is and where he's already put on his body. It's a ton.
Well, and when we're talking about that, I think what needs to be mentioned is the Joe Rogan factor, in that he is a big pusher of that idea that, like, oh man, this guy's like 18, so he's gonna have 15 years where he's just gonna be a killer, and this idea that guys only perpetually get better when they're 18 or when they're 19, and in 10 years they'll just be this peak athlete who's just absolutely killing people, and it ignores what actually happens in the sport. And yeah, we have some really high profile outliers. We have Anderson Silva, who developed late in his career. We have Robbie Lawler, but that's not the norm. That is not the norm at all, in the same way that, just because we have guys in the NFL who can hold down a running back position for 6, 7, 8 years, I mean, the average is still 3 years at that position for an NFL career. Just because there's outliers doesn't mean the average is wrong.
Yeah, and a note on the number of fights thing, it's not necessarily the fights themselves that take the toll. It's just, think about what that means, that if you're fighting every month and a half or every 2 months, you're literally in camp all the time. You're always training at that level. You're cutting weight a lot. Like, that's what chances are good that you're probably sparring quite a bit. That's what does the damage to you long term. It's not the fighting itself. It's not stepping into the cage that does it. It's what you have to do to get ready for that really wears on your body. Like, that's what gets worrisome about Donald Cerrone, is what's he doing in his camps. Like the fights themselves, like, especially Cerrone's last couple of fights, those are not the kinds of things that are going to take years off your life. It's the weight cutting and the sparring sessions and like drilling that involves you having to block stuff and taking like small subconcussive blows. That's what you worry about.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's the big thing too, because like it may be that, and that's why I tend to talk about aging curves, or you talk about progression curves in MMA outside of the idea of aging, because a lot of the motor skill degeneration that we see from fighters tends to be brain trauma induced. Like suddenly a guy is just slower, and he's 31 or something. Like, or like Jamie Varner, where it's suddenly like shit's just falling off you. Like, suddenly one fight you're breaking your ankle, the next fight you're breaking your arm, and every single or Joe Riggs, 32, and you go for a takedown, your neck's just like shit out of joint. Like like you can't fight like that forever.
Or here's another good example: guys who, as they get older, just can't get themselves into the same kind of cardiovascular shape that they were when they were younger. Like Shogun is a really good example of that. Like when Shogun was fighting in Pride, he was a cardio machine. He was always in shape. He worked at an incredibly fast pace. Like even if it went to the decision, like he was still consistently getting output out there for the entirety of the fight. Later into his UFC career, after all the knee injuries and everything, it's just so much harder to do the road work and to do the strength and conditioning stuff that you need to do to get yourself into shape to go three hard rounds, much less 5. Like, and those
are the kind of things that where it's like sometimes it's not just the idea of like, oh, you took all this damage in your fights, but it's just like the damage you take training over the years builds up to the point that you can't train right anymore. Or you can't fight right, and that's the unfortunate truth when it comes to why we talk about guys who are young not staying, not becoming infinite progression curves of talent that we'll watch forever.
Yeah, I mean, also just one final note on that. Like, did you guys watch Rory McDonald when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast?
I missed it.
Nope.
It was really interesting. I mean, I wouldn't classify it as like must watch or anything, but if you happen to catch it, it's worth your time. And Rory McDonald, is what, he's 25, 26, and Rory was talking to Rogan about the kind of maintenance work that he has to do on his body with a massage therapist and physical therapist just to be able to train. Just to be able to train at a high level on a daily or a weekly basis. This is the kind of stuff that he has to do. He has to spend an hour with a massage therapist. He has to do the therapy work. He has to do ice baths and things like that. And that's just, and we're talking about a guy in his mid-20s. Like Big Nog has to spend an hour or two with a massage therapist before every single training session just to get limber enough to train. In addition to that. So, and that's just, and you wonder why guys aren't developing new skills as they get into the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th years of their career. It's because just to be able to go into the gym and do your basic stuff, you have to do all of this maintenance work to get your body there.
Yeah. There's a lot that goes into the physical breakdown that is such a limiting factor that I think people just overlook entirely. And they chalk, like I say, the physical breakdown up to age. It's like, well, you're getting older, so that stuff happens. And it's like it's got nothing to do with getting older. It's got a whole hell of a lot to do with putting yourself through a huge amount of physical strain year and year and year and year. Otherwise you wouldn't see the parity that you see between a 32-year-old and a 40-year-old in this sport. So let's move back though to Fight Night McGregor-Seaver not McGregor-Seaver, but Fox Gustafsson Johnson. Not jumping back 2 weeks. Anyway, it's been a long day. Shut up. This card had a shitload of fun fights and fun prospects and fun performances, and one massive soul-crushing letdown that has torn away everything that I thought was real, and that I hate to give Patrick Wyman any credit for seeing coming at all. Especially when he makes a face like that. I don't know if that's translating over the internet.
What we're seeing right now, that is the Fabricio Werdum coaching just coming to life right there.
Yeah, so obviously I'm talking about Constantina Rokin, who shit as many beds as you can possibly shit in your UFC debut against a fighter that he had beat by all intents and purposes about 30 seconds into the fight. And anybody have any takes on that won't kill me and crush my soul?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it wasn't all bad. Like and I'm not gonna gloat and say that I called it because I didn't, because I still picked Rokin.
Yeah.
Like that's I if I had actually like put my money where my mouth was and picked Pesta, then I would be, you bet your ass I'd be gloating. But I'm not. I mean, I just thought that, like, looking at that fight, this seemed like a distinct possibility to me, because Rokin, it's not like his cardio looked awesome when he was forced to go 3 rounds with Richard Odoms. You know what I mean? On the regional scene, and
Brett
like
Rogers, but yeah.
Oh, was it Brett Rogers? You're right.
Yeah,
You're right.
Odoms was about a minute and a half.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, like I think that if he had finished Pesta with that flurry in the first round, we wouldn't be talking about any of this.
No.
But one of the big differences between guys in the UFC and guys on the regionals is just how much more durable they are. Like we've talked about this before, but it's like you look at some of Rokin's fights in Russia before he made it to the UFC, and they were not early stoppages, but it's like in the UFC, the ref is probably going to let that go for another few shots. Like when he knocked out Dave Huckabee in I think it was the Fight Nights promotion, like that was over after like 2 shots.
Oh man, I wish he'd knocked out Huckabee, but that not Huckabee. But
what? Who knows how to pronounce? I don't care.
I'm just saying that if he'd knocked out Mike Huckabee, would that not have been like the best thing?
Oh yeah, I see where you're going with that. Well, God, Guns and Grits, author Mike Huckabee, Arkansas gentleman, horrific influence on American national politics. I would watch Constantina Rokin knock him out. They're both heavyweights, so take that as well.
Yeah, it'd be fair. It's a fair fight. But
no, I mean, so I think that's part of the difference, that fights that usually get stopped at the regional level a little bit earlier may have given us kind of a false impression of Rokin as a finisher. It just looked to me like he's gotten by on athleticism for a while. So his first level of takedown defense is actually very good. He's got a very quick sprawl. He's got good balance on his single leg defense. The problem is in extended sequences where a guy is going to try and chain wrestle you, that takes a much greater level of technical skill to be able to continuously stuff those shots. Like, we see this from guys like Jose Aldo and Renan Barão, or Junior Dos Santos, who also has excellent takedown defense, where they're comfortable stuffing multiple shots in a row. But that's not the norm for most fighters who we think of as sprawling brawlers. For the most part, it's stuff the initial shot, create space, and get away. But a guy who's going to stay on your hips, like Pesta did with Rokin, that's much harder to deal with. And that's not necessarily something that like Rokin needs to feel bad about. That's just like, okay, you got to work on this going forward. The cardio issue, much bigger issue. Like, and I don't know what the solution is there.
Yeah, I think Rokin kind of had exactly that moment where he just couldn't get by in certain aspects of the fight just purely on athleticism. And as the fight wore on, pretty much all of his technical holes got kind of laid bare for everybody to see. I mean, just not a good ground fighter, not really a great chain wrestler defender. I mean, Pesta got in, I can't remember if it was a single or a double leg in like the 3rd round, and Rokin just had this huge sigh when he got driven back to the fence and then was immediately taken down. As a first performance, obviously it was awful in terms of like getting some hype and coming into the UFC and just getting worked over by a guy that everyone kind of wrote off. But in the long run, I mean, he is an athlete. If he takes this loss to heart and kind of learns from it and reevaluates how he trains, I don't see why we're not still talking about him in 2-3 fights from now in terms of like a rising prospect in the heavyweight division. And I think obviously a lot of people are going to write him off due to this. And I mean, it didn't help that, what was it? Didn't Joe Rogan write him off as a can crusher on the regional scene? Like totally ignoring that, like he's beaten more named guys than like a heavyweight prospect in recent memory.
It's that, like, should we talk about Rogan a little bit and his utter lack of preparation and how that totally fucked up the undercard and all of these really bright young prospects who were doing interesting things? Rogan just it's unbelievable. It's like, it's one thing if you're going to do a pay-per-view main card and it's like you've heard of all of these guys before and Joe's had some exposure to them, like that's okay. But for an international undercard, like, your job is to do your prep. You know, it's the contrast between Rogan and the other commentators, and Rogan and Goldberg together. I mean, we treat them as a pair. Like, you know, I talked to John Anik today on my show. That interview will be up Monday, and Anik was talking about how much he enjoys the preparation and you know, him sitting down to watch fight film and doing research and reading articles, and like, he's like, you know, I take that seriously. I view that as essentially my job. My job is to be prepared and be able to talk about these guys, and it's a tremendous amount of information, but this is what I get paid to do. You know, that's exactly the way that he put it. And you contrast that with a guy who can't even be bothered to click on the fucking Fight Finder links to the guys that Constantina Rokin's fought and see who they are. Like, that's mind blowing. You know, I've made a lot of apologies for Joe Rogan's lack of preparation, and I think that there are cases where his exposure to these guys and his familiarity with them leads him to come up with some pretty insightful stuff. This was not one of those cases, and it's frankly unforgivable. Like, he's not doing his actual job.
The funny thing to me was that I think Goldberg actually did a tiny bit of prep on Rokin. He was like, you know, he talked about him being talked about as a really bright prospect and occasionally setting up his hands with leg kicks and some stuff like that. And it was like he had some minimal notes. And I was kind of like, wow, that's like more than normal. I mean, he defaulted to those notes over and over again in like a sort of mechanical way. But it was kind of impressive while, you know, Rogan was still there spouting off on all these tangents he gets on, can't let go of. But
well, I think if like moving up the card, the Mirsad Becktic fight was one, not the worst in terms of it, but I mean, it was another one where we have this fantastic prospect just beating the shit out of a really tough veteran, and Joe Rogan is just complaining about it the entire way. And it was an awesome performance for Becktic in the sense that, I mean, he went right into Paul Redmond's wheelhouse and just beat the snot out of him. And it was a win in all phases. And Becktic, I'm gonna say his game looks like George St. Pierre's, but not in the sense like I think he's the next George St. Pierre, but in the sense that like he's always working. In any range, in the clinch, at range, on the ground, he's always looking to do damage and inflict pain on his opponent, and he's always driving into them, be it on the cage, on the mat. Every moment he's planting a foot, and you can see him driving off the mat, putting pressure. He really favors like a low passing game. He works his way to the half guard and then works that knee slide. And really, my only complaints about the Becktic fight is that he let Paul Redmond re-guard a bunch. And that's really nitpicking, considering that Paul Redmond's actually a really good ground fighter, and he didn't let Redmond even sniff a footlock during that entire fight, which is Redmond's bread and butter.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where, like, had Rogan done even the most basic research, had he fired up the Wi-Fi on the flight over and watched a little bit of Paul Redmond and Cage Warriors, then he would have known that what Becktic was doing was pretty impressive considering what Redmond has done off his back in the past, you know? But he didn't do that research, and so to him it looked like a guy, like, you know, Becktic was just laying on an Irish boxer. And, you know, like, that's... You know, this is your job, man. Like do what you get paid for. But you know, Becktic looked awesome. I mean, I think you can really see the influence of Ricardo Laborio in Bektic's top game. Like you see that same kind of emphasis on pressure and driving into him. Like I think you really see that very clearly in what Becktic does from top position. In the few instances we saw him strike, he looked pretty good too. I mean, he pummeled Redmond with really nice counter combinations.
Yeah, I would actually say with the GSP comparison that Becktic looks a lot more like GSP than anybody else that's been compared to him in recent memory. I mean, the same like karate background with a high emphasis on wrestling and top control is like a much better comparison to the classic GSP mold.
Well, they're both kind of outfighters. You know what I mean? Like that's at heart. GSP wasn't a pressure fighter. He wasn't a counter fighter. He was really kind of an out fighter whose game was predicated on really explosive in and out movement. And that is actually Bektic's game. You look at him; he's not super comfortable in the clinch. Like he's not a bad clinch fighter at all, and neither was GSP. But he's not. That's not his wheelhouse at all. And part of that has to do with his frame and the way he's built. Like you saw against Chaz Skelly, who's an excellent clinch fighter. Skelly's a very good clinch fighter. It was hard for Becktic to get much leverage. And you saw this when GSP was in the clinch with Nick Diaz too. The same kind of thing, where a much taller, rangier guy who has longer limbs and therefore longer levers, you get better leverage off of it. So he's a guy who prefers to be either in or out. But that's a workable game.
Yeah,
I think. And going back to the point that you said that you can really see Laborio's kind of fingerprints on Becktic. I mean, Laborio comes from the Carlson Gracie school, the original Carlson Gracie team, which is just a team that has a huge impact on kind of grappling in MMA, as Carlson guys went on to form Brazilian top team, American top team, and have just kind of there's so many coaches and guys in the sport who can trace their grappling back through Carlson Gracie, and he epitomizes one of the styles that comes out of there, which is just in the jiu-jitsu world referred to as pass and smash. I mean, that is what he does. He just passes your guard, and the entire time he's just crushing you with pressure. And then if you give into that pressure and you try to turn away from it, he will take your back in an instant. And that's exactly what we saw against Paul Redman. It was a really fantastic performance, and contrary to what Joe Rogan says, I cannot wait to see this guy fight again.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, if you're really just interested in prospects and not interested in ground, even if you didn't love the fight, you should still be recognizing a young fighter getting strong rounds, taking 0 damage, and totally dominating an opponent. That's something that very few young fighters do.
Yeah, what did he get hit 6 times?
Yeah.
The entire fight? Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah,
and pretty happy.
All 6 of them were open palm strikes to the side of the head from guard, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It was as flawless victory as you can get.
Well, one thing I wanted to make a point about just before we move on, then we'll move right on, is that a big my self-created comparison that I'm using for Rokin that's making me warm inside is that I'm comparing him to Albert Tuminov and Tuminov's UFC debut, and that's making me happy. And that idea that you could still the progression was immediate after that terrible entry fight to the UFC in which he got controlled on the ground by somebody he couldn't put away. Anyway, moving right along, Nicky Thrills. Tom has to eat a little long-term crow here because Kryhoff is actually starting to look like a half-decent fighter. He could be ranked by the end of the year.
Should be ranked by the end of the year. I think he's easily the 15th best light heavyweight in UFC right now.
Oh, man.
Womp, womp, Tom.
Tom, what do you got to say for yourself?
It looks like he actually got a wrestling coach, which is a plus. But there's still some underlying problems, like the fact that I still see the underlying Nikita Kryhoff-ness of he locks up an anaconda choke and then doesn't actually know how to roll through with it. That's he couldn't get through the fight without having a Kryhoff moment. Oh my god, I have this. What do I do? It's like the dog that catches the rabbit and then has no idea what to do with it. So yes, he actually looked like a competent MMA fighter. He looked bigger. He looked stronger. I think he's on a real strength and conditioning program. He looked like a confident wrestler. And then Stanislav Netkov got finished by a standing guillotine, which is not good.
Did any of us pick Krylov going into this fight?
I did not. I had Sneaky Nedkov to my everlasting dismay and shame.
I will never pick Nikita Krylov in a fight ever.
Yeah. Okay, so we all had Stucky, so we can't gloat too hard. But he looks like he's improving, and I, for one, am really happy about that because the ability to call him Nicky Thrills and have him walk out to Man with the Twangy Guitar and do all of the hilariously awesome things that he does make me I can't not enjoy watching him fight.
Okay, just real quick, can we talk about his corner man with the flock of seagulls there?
Yes, yes, that was
In
fantastic.
the background, like, dude, that is MMA at its best. That is why we watch this sport, so we can see dudes with dyed flock of seagulls hair rolling their eyes back in their head and sticking their finger up their nose in the background on the Fox Sports 1 network. That is MMA at its core, and I applaud Nikki Thrills for that.
You also forget taking selfies, like in the cage live on television.
Dude, like, he has clearly never heard the advice of, act like you've been there before.
No,
No.
fuck that.
No, that dude is like
That was like Nikita Krylov, like just the day before the event, turned to his roommate and was like, "Hey, you want to go to a fight with me?"
yeah,
Like,
which is awesome. Like,
Yeah.
we should be. That's what it takes to be a top 15 light heavyweight in the UFC, by the way.
it
Right
is.
there.
You
Yeah.
gotta have an entourage of you. You gotta have at least 2 or 3 useless people around you to be considered an elite fighter.
So speaking of, we've talked a bit about guys being overhyped off wins, or losses, is particularly how fighters tend to get overhyped. But is Makwan Amirkhani in danger of becoming way overhyped for his skill?
He is so like he reminds me so much of his next fight, whatever the betting line is going to be so far skewed in favor of him. It really reminds me a lot of the Nicholas Backstrom situation, like where small sample size, a lot of like some real charisma attached to him, and I think there's going to be a strong overreaction to that because I have a hard time seeing Amir Khani as not the like spazzed out grappler that we saw in his regional fights, because we've all watched a lot of Amir Khani.
Yeah.
A flying knee and 8-second knockout is not Makwan Amir Khani's game. It's just not. Like, so
It's not, and he is being overvalued, but he is. I mean, he is so much fun, and he is catching on like with MMA fans. Like if you frequent, like, I know we all kind of spend more time on MMA sites than like normal people should. I mean, there's a lot of talk about him, and he's making the most of it. And coming in, I mean, we all kind of knew that he's a spazzy grappler and he's a showman. And he just kind of loves being the center of attention and kind of having these moments. And the UFC is the place for him. If he can make it work even 50% of the time and win one, lose one, win one, lose one, he's gonna have a place in the UFC for quite a while just because he's a character and he can immediately make people like him. And I mean, as awful as that post-fight interview was, I mean, he did a pretty excellent job in both that and then the post-fight press conference of making people like him. He made Gegard Mousasi smile, which is like, it's unheard of. It doesn't happen.
nuts, man. It's nuts.
It
Yeah,
is.
no,
The thing I will say that I'm happy to see you there was that the knee fluky, or as fluky as that knee was and all that, is that it does show that there is like a level of athletic potential there, like a baseline level of athletic explosiveness and dynamism that maybe that all stars can work with and work on refining and fine tuning. But otherwise, like, people have talked about like Conor McGregor as a Chael Sonnen type figure, which is beyond stupid, we all know at this point. But like Amir Khani is much more likely to be the next Chael Sonnen, it feels like the guy who wins 3 fights and is suddenly getting like top 5 bookings, and you're like, whoa, where did this come from?
dude, no denying the dude's personality, and like if he's actually a pretty solid athlete.
Yeah.
So if he's in the right training situation, like I mean, I actually could see him becoming a pretty good fighter. I don't think I see him becoming like a top 5 or a top 10 kind of guy, but like, good for him if he can if he can parlay like his love of attention and whatnot into being a more marketable and viable fighter. Like, that's awesome. This sport could always use more guys like that.
It's like the Alex Caceres effect in that you're an entertaining dude. You're not going to win every fight. You may not even win the majority of your fights, but people like you and you're entertaining, and they want to see you get out there and fight. And that's, I mean, in the end, in the professional fight business, if you're aware that you're not championship material, like, why not do that? It's going to make you a lot of money.
It's true. Which leads us to a guy who, while maybe not the most thrilling out of the cage personality, is one of the more thrilling in the cage fighters. Top prospect on the rise, Albert Tuminov. What a performance against Nicholas Musoke. Like, that first round, I gave it to Musoke. I was fine with all the scorecards. But once Tumanov found his timing and found his range and figured out what Musoke was doing, he just beat the piss out of him, and it was great.
Uh, Tuminov is the kind of dude who, in a couple of years, is going to be cold cocking like fantastic strikers. Like the fact that a guy as young as he is already has his command of the intangibles that you need to be a really top flight striker, like the sense of timing, distance, his ability to change speeds and mess with his rhythm, to break his rhythm, to get you thinking one thing and then throw his shots around it, like to throw around and under your guard, like that is a really, really, really high level set of skills that he has already. And as those intangibles improve, he's going to be almost impossible to beat on the feet. I mean, I think that the ancillary pieces of his game, he could still use some work on him. I think he's a smaller welterweight, and I think he's always going to be at risk of being controlled, especially in the clinch, more so than on the ground. But those are all things for him to work at. But in terms of his ability to strike at distance, to switch between different modes of striking, to switch between pressuring, playing a pure counter game, an aggressive counter game, like those are all things that he can do, and he transitions between them seamlessly. Like it's a really, really high level set of skills that he has.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I was gonna say I absolutely loved this fight. It was a fantastic. I really get into, I kind of mark out over like distance battles when you really see a guy who wants to establish one range and a guy who wants to establish a slightly closer range, and you kind of see that interplay. I absolutely love those kind of fights, and Pat pointed out last week, the first time I watched Albert Tumenov film of him on the regional circuit, I absolutely marked out and like freaked out about how good this guy looked. And I'm really excited to see him to continue to improve and to move forward. I think he's absolutely an elite fighter in the making, and we're gonna get a lot of fun fights out of this guy before his career is over.
Yeah, and like I said, one of the big things that's happened too, I think, that it appears to be happening, at least to me, is that after that Ildemar Alcantara fight, he's really put some emphasis on his counter wrestling and making sure that, he stuffs the shot, moves out, creates space for himself, and doesn't just get like sucked into these prolonged battles of grinding and clinching and trying to out wrestle an opponent for long periods. And like with that whole closing, that makes him a hugely challenging fighter for anyone to face.
Yeah.
Our last guy we want to talk about a bit, and it's not really a prospect at this point. Obviously, he's about to get a title shot, but he's sort of one of those strange cases, more I would say, of a fighter who got pushed too quickly into this hot prospect mold when he was young and is really probably about where he should be now, maybe just lasting a little longer, is Anthony Johnson, who has just embarked on a title shot after starting at welterweight, and he's getting a light heavyweight title shot, and spent several years out in the wilderness fighting, and is now one of the elite light heavyweights in the world. He's really, I think, to me, the patented case of, it's the arc is how long you've been fighting, not how old you are or how hyped you were at the beginning. He's one of those fighters that is really hard, I think, for a lot of people to forgive and forget about his early career, because you watched him. He got signed to the UFC 1 year into his pro career, and that was fighting Rich Clemente after 1 year in, and then fighting, and he lost that fight. He lost another fight after an eye injury. He was fighting Josh Koscheck 3 years in as a pro. Like, those aren't fights he's gonna win.
No, I mean this it's a really interesting career arc, and just looking back on his career, because he was kind of like the first guy when I was watching MMA. I was very young in my MMA fandom in like 2007, 2008, and he was kind of like the first prospect I really kind of latched onto, and I mean, it was the Kevin Burns fight, the eye injury. I mean that's a standout and just god awful refereeing that was allowed to be that was allowed to be a win for Kevin Burns and not a no contest. But just his performance beforehand in that fight, his performance against Tom Spear, the second fight with Kevin Burns, where he just absolutely destroyed him. It was a case of like we had a clear, really athletic young man with really good striking, and the UFC legitimately didn't know how to handle it. I feel like they threw him into some deep waters. They allowed him to keep being a welterweight when it was obvious that was not where his future was. And it's just been a weird career path, but kind of in that mold that, like, I think even the UFC was a little too quick to kind of write him off in some ways, and I think he in some ways needed that being cut to kind of wake him up in some ways on the whole weight cutting issue. But he has come a really long way technically, and he's only in his ninth year of professional fighting, so he's kind of he's in that peak. He is at his peak as a professional fighter, and frankly, I mean, defensively speaking, he doesn't take a ton of damage in his fights. I kind of peg him as a guy. He's going to have like an extended peak as a fighter, and I think it's a really exciting to see a guy with this kind of odd and yet totally normal aging curve, but an odd path through it to be kind of hitting his peak as a fighter.
Yeah, Johnson is also one of these guys who he was pretty aggressive early in his career, but he's effectively evolved into kind of a pressuring counter fighter, an aggressive counter fighter, you might say, and guys who fit that profile tend to take a little longer to come into their own, because it just takes so much experience to get to the point where you can judge somebody's timing and their distance, and you can react to their shots with the proper series of counters early on. And like, it's to the point now where like his preference for countering has become so strong that he doesn't even really look all that comfortable leading these days. Or like that he really looks a little bit uncomfortable doing that, which to me, like, you know, I'm not saying that he's the next Anderson Silva or anything like that, but like there are some strong similarities in terms of very defined counter fighters who really look uncomfortable when they're forced to take the lead. When Gus finally started throwing at him, suddenly Johnson looked much more comfortable in that fight, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like I'm not going to pick him against John Jones, but but he is a really hard fighter to game plan around and to figure out how to deal with. I'm not sure exactly how I would go about doing that if I were Jones's coaches.
Yeah, especially because Jones, like, the way he tends to throw strikes when he's exchanging with people lets him get hit, and when he gets hit, he tends to kind of turn away from it. He tends to not take punches terribly well. I mean, he's got a hell of a chin, so it's not like, oh, he's going down the first big one. But, you know, it wasn't like Gustafsson or Cormier had any trouble finding his head when they wanted to. And
yeah, he's a guy that the way that Connor talks about it, the way that Connor talks about this, and I think it's probably the easiest way to think about it, is that Jones really lacks a second layer of defense. Like, you see a lot of these guys who tend to rely on especially if they're very long, they rely on that length, and they rely on their footwork and their angles as their main line of defense. That if you can get past that and you can start putting leather on target, it's not like they have great head movement or great parries or anything like that to catch the shots that get past their length and angles. And that's a really dangerous spot to be in against Rumble, you know. Because also Rumble, this is another one of those kind of subtle things. He'll only, like in the finishing sequence, he was only throwing right hands or left hands at any given time. But what was he doing with the other hand? It wasn't. He was measuring with it. You know, that's something that's you would see a lot of really old school boxers, like real punchers, who would do that. Anderson Silva does that.
Yep.
Anderson Silva, when he's in a finishing sequence, is usually only throwing one hand at a time. He's holding you at range and feeling where you are with the other, and then moving into that shot. Like, that's, it sounds fairly basic, but that's actually not something that we see all that much from even very good MMA strikers.
Yeah, I think to the point of Rumble's progression too. We talk about the Vitor Belfort loss perhaps needing to happen. This is something, when we talk too about Jordan Meehan and the idea of like when you're at a small camp forever, you're not progressing, and getting to something bigger and it changing. Like, I think that Belfort loss and getting cut from the UFC, I think that was before he went to the Black Gazillions. At which point, before then, he was in I don't remember what, like,
He was with Kung Lee.
Yeah, that was the Belfort fight was his first with the Black Zillions. He had
it was
just
his
got
first with the Black Zillions.
No, wait. Actually, I think you're right because Belfort wasn't Belfort one of the members of the Black Zillions?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So Johnson couldn't have been with them. I think he got together with them after that fight. You're absolutely right. Sorry.
And that has really changed a guy who seemed to be very athletic, but was not progressing terribly well. Like, his kickboxing was really mechanical. It was really like throw powerful high kicks. Here are some ugly 1-2s. Like, he's never been a comfortable pressure fighter. When he's the aggressor, he's never been a comfortable aggressor. And but he didn't have any counter skill. Like, he was not a counter fighter at all at that time. And suddenly you go to the Black Zillions, and now we've seen this slow evolution of a raw but super athletic prospect into somebody that is now supremely technical. And this is one of those things too why I feel like I have to say this to people, and it comes up with a lot of fighters that people tend to write off early, or say, oh well, they're technically they're just ugly, and ugly really no technique at all. Is if the athletic tools are there, like, that's the part you can't change.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know what's going to happen down the road for some of these fighters, and what situation they're going to find, what trainer they're going to find, who's going to suddenly turn their technical career, their technical progression around, and make use of all these athletic tools that they've been just kind of fiddling with for years.
Look at Ally Aquinta, perfect example of this. Who's fighting on tomorrow's UFC 183 card. Aquinta, very athletically talented guy, very quick, very very strong, very explosive. Not like in the jump off the screen sense, but he's a very solid, very good athlete. And look at what he's done since his loss to Michael Chiesa. Every single fight he's gotten better, because if you put a guy who has those tools in the right situation, he's gonna improve consistently. And Rumble, as a striker, I think Rumble is a guy who, even more than most, benefits from somebody who thinks about it the way that Henry Hooft does. That Hooft really clearly believes that there is a right way and a wrong way to do things within the system that he's teaching. So you see guys struggle a little bit when they first get there, and they've got to totally tear down everything that they're doing. And if you've ever worked with a Dutch style coach, they will have you just walk back and forth across the gym, practicing moving your feet as you throw punches and keeping your weight under you. And you'll do that for entire classes. And it's really frustrating, and it's ugly, and you don't feel comfortable with it. And then one day all of it clicks, and you're like, okay, I get what I'm doing here now. And I can see how for somebody like Rumble, you just need somebody who's going to work your fundamentals and work them and work them and work them and work them. And that's the kind of coach that Hooft is, And now you see Rumble doing really advanced things and doing them really well. But, it just takes a while to adjust to that. And you could see him struggling through that against guys like DJ Linderman, Even if he finished him early, he just didn't look super comfortable.
Yeah, I think Hooft is one of those guys that doesn't get talked about a ton in kind of the big MMA sphere out there, but deserves to be to the same degree that Dwayne Ludwig is as a striking coach. I think Hooft has just been an outstanding influence on the Black Zillions, and we can see marked improvements. And I do think you get to this idea that he very much breaks guys back down and then builds them back up as strikers. And I think that it's a longer process than kind of what Ludwig has done with the Team Alpha Male guys, where he kind of built on top of what they already had. But I think in the end you get results that are pretty stunning. It's very kind of it's very kind of Soviet sport like system sort of thing, where like when I was under a Soviet coach in college in fencing, the first year I was there was them literally tearing me down and then being like, all right, now you can actually learn how to do this sport right. And I kind of get that. I get that same sense off of Hooft, where it's just when you see guys come to the Black Zillions, there tends to be like a regression fight where their striking doesn't even look as good as it used to be because they're kind of relearning the basics that they were doing wrong from the get-go.
Yeah, look at Dennis Cedeno in his last fight against Chad Laprise. Just did not look. Who's another guy who just showed up at the Black Zillions? Just did not look comfortable at all trying to strike. And he's a very quick, very athletic, very explosive guy. But despite those physical gifts, he looked worse than he had in his previous outings. He just was not. It just was not there.
Yeah, it's definitely, and that might be a case where it's almost like, did him less of a favor than leaving him alone might have been, because we may never see you to Cedeno get back to the big stage again, Yeah. Like, sometimes that doesn't always work out. For the guys, you see guys like Burns or Usman, guys who are getting into that system early, and the progression has been, like, stunning. And that's been like quick, like, oh my God, these guys not only are they fantastic wrestlers and grapplers, but they're also amazing strikers. So, Rumble can be seen in some ways as like, if you're looking for the future, Black Zillions up on the rise, like he's sort of the guy that they're striving a lot, I think, to look like. That's the kind of progression that you're hoping to see out of them. Which, on that note, I think brings us to a close because we've run well over and we've talked about everything we wanted to talk about. So thank you guys both for joining me again. You can find me on Twitter at ThezaneSimon, Patrick at Patrick_Wyman, and Tom at TP_Grant. You can find Tom and I on Bloody Elbow. You can find Pat over at SureDog. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in.